Okay, well, it is 11:30 Mountain Time, so that means that we're going to get started. I know people are going to continue to stream in, so I will just start off by saying hi. My name is Annie Burgess, and I am the lab director here at ESIP. Just a few reminders that a couple of Zoom reminders to be kind and courteous with your mute button, though we do encourage you to have your cameras on if you so choose to see your colleagues and have them see you. A reminder that there is a reaction button at the bottom of your window. So if you do have a question, you could use, that's where you could find the raise hand feature, and we'd encourage you to use that. The session is being recorded, so that will be able to be shared post-session. And lastly, that ESIP does have a code of conduct. If you haven't familiarized yourself with that, you can see it linked to the bottom of the Google Doc that is associated with this session. Oh, and I forgot to note that we would love for you to add in the attendance doc in that Google Doc next to the session in Kiko chat to go ahead and add your name there. So with that, I will turn it over to Amy.
Cool. I'm wondering if we should give it a couple of minutes just because the instructions are kind of important. So I might give it just a minute for other people to join. Or maybe I can start going over it and I'll recap for the group if I see a lot more people join in the next 5 minutes. So yeah, like Annie said, if you haven't already opened up the Google document, we want to make sure everybody gets a chance to sign in there. So if you open up that Google document, add your name and affiliation, and then right below the attendance and check-in, there is a link to the slides, which is going to guide us through this session. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And so these are the slides I just mentioned. So I'm going to start off by going through these slides and giving everybody some sort of instructions about where we're headed with this session today. And then basically pass it off to the actual lightning speakers to get started with the actual content. So I want to say first off, thank you everyone for joining. I'm really excited about this session. This is the ESIP Cloud Computing Cluster session, which is one of the clusters that ESIP organizes. The Cloud Computing Cluster, just as a little bit of background, we meet monthly for knowledge sharing sessions. And there's a link to our YouTube channel at the bottom of these slides. So we have monthly sessions. We presented on things like Stack for cloud optimized geotiffs that are on the Microsoft Planetary computer. We will probably have a dedicated session to, Kerchunk, which is something that Lucas is going to talk about later on. So yeah, please, one of the action items from this session is going to please join our cloud computing cluster if these topics are of interest of you, which if you're here, they probably are. So with that, the goal for this session is basically that we, the Earth data community, use this opportunity to share our experiences generating and using analysis-ready cloud optimized data. So this is a really great space and forum. ESIP is really the perfect forum for us to gather as the Earth data community, and specifically the sort of more technical data provider side of the community, to gather and talk about our experiences making large archives of geospatial data available and accessible, not just available, but also very accessible and easy to use for the Earth data community. So our agenda today is pretty packed. So I'm going to go over this. All right now, so we know where we're headed. So these times are all in Eastern, of course. So starting right now, for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to be basically talking about what we're going to be doing during the session. So we're going to be talking about some work in progress guidance documents. And these guidance documents are basically actually what kind of motivated this session to begin with. So I was hearing a lot of requests for input in terms of people's insight into generating things like cloud optimized geotiff and czar. People keep coming up with the same common questions like, how do I decide how many overviews to have for my cloud optimized geotiff? How do I decide what chunking is right for my czar store? So this session was really motivated by the fact, like, maybe we could all get together in a session like this and start to generate those guidance documents. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about those documents, but really probably honing in on refining those documents in later cloud computing cluster sessions. So then following this gathering and agenda setting, we're going to have our lightning talks. Very excited for those. Then we're going to have some, what I'm calling progressive collaboration. So after our lightning talks, which are meant to sort of get the wheels turning by hearing from people's experiences, we're going to be doing, like what I said, progressive collaboration, where we're basically starting with some individual silent brainstorming. So during the individual silent brainstorming, you're going to be opening up a Slido poll. And in the Slido poll, you're going to be typing your answers to these questions for about 10 minutes. And that's going to be used basically both to get your wheels turning about what are the interesting questions to you about the space of generating cloud optimized data, but also informational for us, the organizers, to understand what brings you to this session. So you're going to have 10 minutes to sort of get the wheels turning on your own. And then the next 20 minutes is going to be a small group brainstorming and voting. So you're going to share your responses from that Slido poll. And then we're going to be basically voting on questions in a Slido Q&A. So there's another feature in Slido called Q&A, where you can basically type your question if you have questions that you want the whole group, so that means all 60 of us or whatever, to discuss as a group. You would put your question in here if you want it to be discussed as a large group, or you can vote on existing questions. So if I think Rich's question is the most interesting here, I could upvote it. Those votes are going to be used for us in the next section, which is the fishbowl. So there we're going to take the questions with the most upvotes and basically ask them to the group in the hopes that people with, there's a lot of people with a lot of experience as this whole session included in this whole session. So we're going to basically be discussing those upvoted questions in the fishbowl. So then we're going to have a break, and then we're going to have tutorials on Kerchunk and PangeoForge, and then wrap up and next steps. So that's pretty much the agenda. Before I move forward, are there any questions about any of that? Anything I should repeat? Okay, so then I'm going to very quickly go through the rest of these slides, and then we're going to jump into the lightning talks. So key message 1, a use case should drive the decision of if ARCO is needed, and if so, ARCO design decisions. So one thing we've really noticed as a group of people that have been working on analysis ready cloud optimized data is that we can't just create these data stores in isolation. We really need a use case to drive the design, and then the design decision, drive the decision to use ARCO, and then also the design decisions about, what is the right chunk size and what is the right number of overviews, et cetera. And key message 2 is we're not proposing any one specific solution. We are sharing options and considerations. This is an ongoing area of development. So that's why it's really important that we include everybody in this discussion, and also have follow-up discussions in future cloud computing cluster sessions, because as we all know, the technology is changing. Technology and the solutions are changing quickly. Okay, so background reading and guidance documents. So these are really meant to give some background reading if anybody is sort of really new to the space of cloud optimized data stores, and specifically GeoTIFF and ZAR. So that's sort of background reading. And then the documents that we're going to be working on refining based off of the input of this session and future cloud computing cluster sessions. There is a blog post that I think mainly Ryan Abernathy, Vincent Sarago, and I'm forgetting his name, Grega have been working on. So there's a blog post on COG and ZAR for geospatial data. So I think it would be really great to work on that blog post collaboratively as part of the cloud computing session activities. And then we're also working on guides for generating and using cloud optimized GeoTIFFs. These two guides are really open for contributions at this point. If you feel like you want to review the existing content and add to it or add questions for those guides, I really encourage you to do that. These guides and the blog post will be refined, as I mentioned, in future ESIP cloud computing cluster sessions and posted as blog posts and linked in our cloud computing cluster website. Okay, so with that, I think we are, okay, so let me just actually share the Fishbowl questions poll is, again, where you're gonna do your silent brainstorming. Then we're going to, so we're gonna jump into the lightning talks in a minute here. We're gonna do that individual brainstorming, and then we're going to be doing the group brainstorming. So during the group brainstorming, you're going to be doing your introductions, what is your name, affiliation, share responses to individual questions, brainstorm together what questions or lessons learned would be good for the Fishbowl, and then add new questions with named speakers and vote on existing questions. You don't need to necessarily add your name to the Slido poll, to the Slido Q&A, but I will be asking for the most upvoted questions. I will be asking for the most upvoted questions for those people to present their questions to the group in the Fishbowl. Okay, so what is the Fishbowl? So a Fishbowl is basically it's a teaching strategy where in a Fishbowl discussion, students seated inside the Fishbowl actively participate in a discussion by asking questions and sharing their opinions, while students standing outside listen carefully to the ideas presented. Students take turns in these roles so that they practice being both contributors and listeners in a group discussion. So this is a great structure for discussing controversial or difficult topics. So again, we're going to go to, for that, we're going to go to, this actually should say Fishbowl questions Q&A. So that is going to be this feature where you basically vote, you add questions or vote on existing questions. Okay, so I think we are now ready to jump into the lightning talks unless there's any questions about where we're going with this. Okay, cool. I know that was a lot. We're going to do it together. Okay, here we go. So next section is the lightning talk. So with this, I think, Dumai, are you ready to present?
Yeah, let me start sharing. Oh, I think it says host disable participant screen sharing.
Let's see.
You should be good to go now.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
See my screen okay?
Yes.
All right. So sorry, there's some construction. Hopefully it doesn't pick up too much. But okay, I'll get started. My name is Dimash. I'm a PhD student in computer science at CU Boulder, but I'm living in Seattle right now. And I'm also an intern at NASA Goddard with Alexei Shokolinin. And we've been working on a project exploring the optimal
Tumai, can I ask you to hold on just a second? We're getting some feedback on your mic. It might be rubbing against your shirt if it's a like a mic from your headphones. Any chance you could try maybe just the computer mic rather than your headphone mic? It might be easier to hear even if there's some construction noise in the back.
Okay, yeah. Does that sound better?
Ooh, that sounds way better. Yep. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
go
there
for
might
it.
be construction, but this is just 5 minutes, so hopefully I'll be
Yep,
done
this sounds
before
good.
they
Thank you so
resume. Okay.
much.
Yep, a project on the optimal strategies for storing earth science data sets in the commercial cloud. And this project is a collaboration with two other interns, Joanna and Marina. All right, so this project was developed as a part of the EIS Fire Portal, which very briefly is a cloud-based project designed to support the understanding of fire activity through an interactive website. But overall, we think the questions and results about efficient czar storage could be relevant for other areas as well. So some of the questions we're thinking of is, first, how does the chunking scheme or how the data points are arranged and grouped affect usage and analysis of the multidimensional data sets in czar format? And what are the optimal chunking strategies for storing these data sets on the cloud? To answer the questions, we'll test the performance of these different chunking strategies. And then to give you a visual sense of that, what that might look like. Here we have a data cube representing a data set with the 3 dimensions, X, Y, Z, and the data points in each dimension can be grouped into chunks of different sizes. So depending on the strategy, the data cube can look very different. And the data set we work with is the GEO's forward processing data set in the czar format, which, as the group knows, is nice for storage of chunked and compressed multidimensional arrays. And this data set comes from the GEO's, which is a high resolution global atmospheric model and includes analyses and forecasts produced in real time. And so here's the default chunking scheme of this data set. So you can see in the time dimension, there are small chunks, each is 1 hour, so about a total of 5,000 chunks. And then on the other hand, the spatial or longitude and latitude dimensions contain one big chunk of the maximal sizes. So what we will do is change up the way this data cube looks. We will rechunk each of the 3 dimensions to different chunk sizes, so ranging from very small sizes to the maximum. And to keep this grid to 2D, we show the time chunk sizes in the y-axis and both the spatial dimensions or longitude and latitude in the x-axis. And we have some hypotheses. When we're working with in the time dimension, say doing some time series analysis, then the optimal chunking strategies with the larger time chunk sizes may be the most optimal in the approximate top left corner. And when we're working with the spatial dimensions, say with maps, then this corner down here with the large spatial chunks might be the way to go. So we make all these versions of the data set and then store them in an AWS S3 bucket. And we want to test how they affect the usage of the data first in terms of CPU time, which is good for knowing how responsive a process is. So one common task in data analysis or operation, if you will, is to draw a time series at a single location. So we can picture in the data cubes at some longitude and latitude coordinate, we're extracting data in the time dimension. And then another common task or operation is to draw a map at say 1 time step. So we can picture it as a plane through a single time slice. And for drawing a time series, what we observe is what we hypothesize is that the region of the optimal strategies or those costing the least CPU time is up at the top left, where the spatial chunks are smaller and the time chunks are larger. And then the worst performing strategies with the darker orange are in the opposite region. And then to give you some idea of the big range between the least time and the most time, the least time is in green is 0.02 versus the most time, which is in blue, 50 seconds. So probably a big difference when loading and analyzing data. And then for drawing a map, we see the opposite trend and the trade-off, again, very in line with the expectations. The most optimal strategies are when the spatial chunks are very large and time chunks are very small. And again, I annotated the best and worst single strategies, and they're of a pretty similar range to the time series heat map. And then finally, we also want to have an idea of what the optimal is when we combine the two tasks, when they have this obvious trade-off. So we took the product of the two heat maps and observed that the optimal region is now lying more in the intermediate region there. And again, the green square for the smallest CPU time. And then another performance metric we look at is the peak memory that gives us some sense of the minimal size of the machine needed to run these operations. And the heat map here shows the trends in the CPU time results, or shows similar trend as seen in the CPU time result. And again, a pretty big range between the best and worst. For example, 2.22 gigabytes versus 4 gigabytes in the peak memory. And then in the product heat map, we again see the middle space being optimal. And then finally, in addition to assessing the time and memory, some other results that we find important and interesting. The strategy does have a big effect on the time it takes to rechunk from the default data set. So larger chunk sizes take a lot less time, or the paler green, say 0.1 hour compared to those with very small sizes in the dark green that can take to like 40 hours. And then the optimal ones from the previous product heat maps are brought back here as the green squares. So we sort of weigh this with the previous results. We weigh the previous results in time and memory against this additional observation. And then lastly, another observation is the storage size. And this is interesting because they all contain the same exact data, right? So we thought that this heat map would just be one color, but the strategy actually shows some compression effect, especially with the large spatial chunks at the very right side there. Okay, so finally, some conclusions from this work that there is some performance trade-off between optimizing for spatial and time series analyses as expected, but we were able to identify a range of strategies that perform pretty well and also those that don't perform very well for both kind of analyses. And then some things to consider in the future, maybe higher dimensional data sets that are common in earth science. And maybe the trade-off will be a lot more significant there. And also we consider the time and spatial analyses in isolation, but perhaps there are some analyses that span multiple dimensions simultaneously. And lastly, I want to mention that we're organizing the results of this project. So what you've seen and some additional results into a peer review publication. So a tangible outcome that we hope to contribute to the ARCO effort. So feel free to reach out if you'd like to talk more about ZAR and chunking. And so to wrap it up, I'd just like to acknowledge the EIS Fire team and all the collaborators that worked with us on this project and the EIS Fire project at large. And thank you for having me and for your time.
Awesome, thank you so much. Super interesting topic. Like I mentioned in the chat, and Annie as well, if you have questions for Dumai, I would put them in that Slido Q&A section. And then Dumai, you can feel free to follow up on those. If we have time, of course, it would be nice to ask all the questions. I'm sure there's lots of questions for Dumai, so feel free to follow up offline and ask questions in the chat as well. So with that, let's move to Anderson.
Okay. assume you can see my screen. If not, just let me know.
Yeah.
Give me a second. Okay. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. My name is Anderson Banihirgo and I work as a software engineer at NCAR. And I'm going to give a brief overview of the CSM lens data set that we put on AWS S3. So if you're not familiar with CSM lens, it's basically the community Earth system model large ensemble, which is it's a complex data set to a certain extent. So it consists of 40-member ensemble of climate simulations from 1920 to 2100 with basically different initial conditions. So the data is produced on 2 spatial grids. So you have the land and atmosphere components of the model that are basically on the same grid, and then the ocean and ice also on the same grid as well. So you have surface and 3D data. So the data is also produced at different temporal resolutions as well. The full data set is roughly 500 terabytes. So this is for CSM1, because there's actually an upcoming version of CSM2 that is in progress, and it's also being put on AWS. So this is for CSM1. Today and in the past, the only way you could actually access the data was if you had access to the NCAR HPC systems. You basically could actually compute on some of these data sets. Otherwise, you had to basically go on the NCAR Climate Data Gateway and then download the data. And if you want to do science at scale, this is not something you can actually rely on, because one, the data size is huge. So just downloading and having multiple copies in different places was kind of becoming problematic. So as a result, we basically partnered with AWS. So they gave us 100 terabyte of storage allocation through the AWS Open Data Sponsorship Program. So AWS covers the egress and the S3 storage cost. So far we've put 70 terabytes of the 500 terabyte in the cloud. So the data, so we looked at the historic usage and tried to kind of figure out what are the most popular data variables. And those are the ones that we started with. So we put those in the cloud, but users who are using this data set, they can actually request additional data if they want to. So we're now focusing on monthly, daily, and 6-hour frequencies. So it's also both surface and 3D fields as well. So this is roughly 280 ZAR stores from like 10,000 NetCDF files. To produce this data set, so that was back in 2018, we basically put together a bunch of custom scripts. At the time, ZAR was relatively new, so an intake was also another tool that we used as part of this process. And there's this plugin called Intake ESM, which we use to catalog the existing NetCDF files so that we can actually access them and then convert them to ZAR through Dask and Xarray. And then once we had put the data on the file system, we used Globus to actually do the transfer from the file system to AWS. So it was basically like a bunch of custom scripts that, to a certain extent, it's hard to replicate. So once we had the data on the cloud, we also provided some example that at least kind of showed how to use this data set. Even though people are familiar with that data set, the file format, in this case ZAR, is relatively new to the users. So we kind of had to put together some examples showing people how to actually use like intake and Xarray. And so if you're interested, if you go to the Panjur Gallery, there's this section where you have actually like a few notebooks that show you how to use this data set in the cloud. So now let me switch gears and actually talk about some of the challenges. So again, as I mentioned, we produced this test in 2018. So at the time, so some of the data were actually stored on tape archive, which meant that part of the conversion process actually involved transferring data from the tape archive to the POSIX file system. And that's a slow process. We also found that there's some corruption and some discrepancies in the original NetCDF data. So we kind of we had to make some decision on what to do. Like, do we correct these issues, or do we just leave them as they are? So that's one of the challenges. And also deciding on the chunking strategy. Well, one lesson is that there's no one size fits all. So when it comes to chunking, it depends on what access patterns you're expecting. And in this case, we basically tried to come up with a compromise that not necessarily was perfect for everyone, but at least guarantees that we don't penalize some of the use cases. But so that's an ongoing, I guess, task, figuring out what is the right way to chunk the data set. Eventually, I think it turns out that you basically have to think about what use cases you're going to basically be exploring with that data set. So with that, I will wrap it. And if you have any questions, yeah, please feel free to put them in Slido, and then I'll address those later. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay.
I think next up is Lucas.
Alrighty, since we're pressed for time and I want to be able to answer questions if possible during a quick 5-minute talk, I did pre-record mine. So if anybody has questions while I'm presenting that, you are welcome to type in chat and I'll be monitoring that. Hello, my name is Lucas. I'm an atmospheric science PhD student at UC Davis, and today I'm going to be talking about Kerchunk, which is a project I became involved with during a summer internship in parallel computational sciences through the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Before I begin, I'd like to highlight a few of my other authors here. Martin Durant and Rich Signal are some of the brains behind Kerchunk and the lead developers, as well as Shel Gentleman, Kevin Paul, and Julia Kent, who were my mentors for the SciParks internship program. So today you're going to be hearing a lot about different ARCO, analysis-ready, cloud-optimized data formats, and when it's best to use one over the others. But what about the times where it's not possible to change the data format? For example, many existing scientific datasets are already available in the cloud, but in their archival form, either NetCDF, HDF, GRIB, stuff like that. So in this case, converting to ARCO would mean either you lose access to the original formats, or you'd have to duplicate the data itself. So if you'd either have to replace NetCDF with ZAR or host ZAR alongside NetCDF, and neither one of these options may be that great. So this is where I'll introduce Kerchunk. Kerchunk allows for simple and fast access to common data formats like NetCDF, HDF, and GRIB via FSpec's reference file system. It provides cloud-optimized access without the need to actually convert to more cloud-friendly data formats. How does this work? It works by consolidating metadata about the HDF, NetCDF, or GRIB file into a ZAR spec JSON. I'll show you what that looks like here. On the left here is a typical HDF5 file. It has data chunks in gray and metadata in purple. Converting this to ZAR would involve writing each data chunk to a separate file object, and then consolidating the metadata and writing that into a plain text file. Kerchunk, through reference file system, takes the ZAR metadata specification, but instead of pointing to individual file objects, the data chunks are mapped to their corresponding byte ranges inside of the existing HDF5 file. So what does this mean? This means that a Kerchunk allows for fast, easy access to existing cloud datasets without the need to actually convert data. It's asymptotically as fast as ZAR itself, and it has plug-and-play compatibility with X-Ray and FSpec, tools that are well known and supported. Reference metadata JSONs are small easily and cheaply hosted and shared, and can even be generated by third parties, meaning that the data host doesn't even necessarily need to be involved. A single metadata file can describe a multi-file data set and represent those many files as a single X-ray dataset, meaning that huge datasets can easily be opened in a matter of seconds and you can get straight to work. So how fast is it actually? We did a benchmark comparing access times and workflow times to make Go16 24-hour CONUS imagery from weather satellite, an RGB composite, some spatial gradients, and a time series. In NetCDF4, it took 0 time to process the files because they exist that way in the cloud already. But to open the data with X-ray took 10 minutes, and to run that workflow, it took 40 minutes, but there was no extra storage. With ZAR, converting the files to ZAR took 1 hour and 38 minutes, but then opening the dataset with X-ray took 30 seconds, and running that workflow took 4 minutes. But it generated 52 gigabytes of additional storage, which was the size of all the NetCDF4 files approximately. Running Kerchunk, it took about 1.5 hours to make all of the reference metadata, but then only 35 seconds to open the data in X-ray, which is about the same as ZAR, and only marginally slower in actually making the workflow. But we only generated 416 megabytes of additional files, which are the size of the metadata files that were generated in this first step. So this is much more easily shareable and much more cheaply hostable than the 52 gigabytes generated by converting to ZAR. This was a rapid overview of Kerchunk. If you want to learn more and see it in action, please check out the tutorial later in the session where I'll be giving a quick overview of what it looks like to actually use. Feel free to contact me via email or Twitter that are listed here. And if you want to see some code samples, a poster from AGU that I presented, the Kerchunk GitHub, and more, here is a link or a QR code from that AGU presentation that I have listed here. Thank you very much, and feel free to type your questions in the chat, and I will try and answer them. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to the tutorial a little bit later, and then we're ready for our last lightning talk from Don.
All right, everybody hear me? Okay, let's see here.
Yes, I can see your screen.
Awesome. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Don Setyawan, and I am a software engineer with the Ocean Observatory Initiative Regional Cabled Array at the University of Washington. Today, I will talk to you about my experiences with ARCO and the development of Interactive Oceans Data Portal. So this Interactive Oceans Data Portal is an interface designed to enable scientists, educators, and students to quickly discover, access, and visualize cabled real-time OI data produced by RCA. We have two main applications in this data portal called the Interactive Map applications and the Data Visualization application. And so within the Interactive Map application, we use COGS, which are the cloud-optimized GeoTIFF, to serve out our ocean bathymetry and seafloor photomosaics, which are currently stored in S3 bucket. And they're served out in web maps using a serverless AWS Lambda function powered by T-Tyler, developed by Development Seed. So here's just what it looks like. You have on the left there a COG bathymetry layer, very pretty bathymetry of the seafloor. And then you have on the right side, a more of a detail of the seafloor photomosaic where you can really see creatures in the bottom of the seafloor. You can see crabs there in this example. And then the data visualization application here, we use ZAR to store our underlying data stream, which is a chunk compressed and dimensional array storage. And each of the data stream is stored as a singular ZAR file in S3 bucket and has its own conversion pipeline from NetCDF to ZAR. And users can access these underlying data streams using an intake catalog, which are updated daily. And the visualization application itself is actually powered by a custom REST API that we have developed using a HoloViz suite of libraries. And here's just an example of what it looks like. This is a Bloom Dynamics analysis example. So we have this profiler instrument that goes up and down the water column about 200 meters, sampling in a frequency of seconds. And this is just a year overview of that. You can see up top is a chlorophyll sample, and then the bottom is a dissolved oxygen sample, and just being able to see the two differences there. And then here's our actual data pipeline for the conversion of the netcdf to the ZAR file, which is actually inspired by PangeoForge version 0.1.0 to be more specific. And there it has 3 stages. Stage 1, data managers such as myself create a pull request in the meta.yaml format for the instrument that we would like to get from the OI data center in this stage harvest repository. From there, GitHub Action kicks in and create 4 additional, well, in this case, 4 additional data stream repository. And some of the instrument have 1 data stream or multiple data stream. Then from there, then the actual data request happens to the OI data center, which then outputs these netcdf files, which netcdf files, and which then gets converted to ZAR files with a prefed cloud pipeline running in AWS Elastic Container Service. And then, as I mentioned earlier, intake catalog is generated daily, which you can see there on the lower right corner of what that looks like. So what are the challenges in what we did? This data that I'm dealing with is a high resolution time series, which currently X-ray doesn't load lazy load dimensions. So, you know, this can be very tricky. And so I created my own module to handle all these concatenation to create this large ZAR file. And also I've created this custom REST API using the module that I from above to serve out the data visualization, because right now, if I try to read my ZAR file with the intake catalog, it does take quite some time. And then dependent libraries change so fast. Luckily, the storage of the pipelines are actually stored in as Docker images, so I can just test out new latest versions of libraries. And currently, I'm not sure if there's any standards for time series data catalog. You know, there's Stack, but that's more for the spatial side of things. So I created my own kind of quote unquote standard for these catalogs. And here's just an example of the 4 billion time points that I have for one of my data stream as a dimension. So what's next? I'm keeping improving the portal for multiple dimensions data support for the more complex instruments, create real-time data visualization and pipelines. Currently, we're experimenting with streams, which is a really great library for this. And once X-ray has lazy dimension, just hoping to be able to read from the catalog itself. And with that, thank you for listening. And here's just the acknowledgement for all the people that are involved and the group from the Pangeo NASA Access Group at UW Science Institute for all the support and contributions.
Awesome, thank you. I think I'll definitely want to go through that presentation again, some really interesting ways that you visualize those data sets. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to walk through what the next steps are again before we hop into breakout groups. So the next section of this workshop is basically generating and actually discussing as a group some questions. This is obviously a very active area of development, these cloud optimized data stores and how to generate them. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to break out into 5 breakout rooms. Everybody's going to be assigned a breakout room with a facilitator. That would be myself, Annie, Alex Mandel, Lucas, or Rich Signell. So we're going to be facilitating these breakout groups for the next 30 minutes or so. I've actually cut it down a little bit just because the lightning talks The lightning talks went a little bit longer than I estimated, which totally makes sense. So we're going to do some individual silent brainstorming for the first 10 minutes. So for that, we're all going to go to the Slido poll. For the next 15 minutes, then we're going to do the small group brainstorming. So that's going to be sharing responses from the Slido poll questions first, and then adding and voting on the questions in the Slido Q&A. So again, there's two sections of Slido. One is the Q&A and one is the poll. You're going to start by silently working on questions in the poll section, and then as a group, basically share your responses to those Slido poll questions, and then add and vote on questions in the Slido Q&A. So a lot of people have already been adding questions to the Slido Q&A. So you can feel free to add or vote on those questions. If you have extra time during the individual silent brainstorming 10 minutes, you can also feel free to take that 10 minutes to just read the questions in the Slido Q&A and vote there. Does that all make sense so far? And then we'll, if it does.
Amy, do you have the Slido code?
Yes, the Slido. So start with the Slido poll. Start with the Slido poll for the first 10 minutes, and then jump into the Slido. Once you're done with the poll, feel free to jump into the questions and work on those as a group. But if you're done with your silent brainstorming after the 10-minute, before the 10 minutes is up, feel free to start reading through those questions in the Q&A and voting on them. So yeah, start with the poll, then the Q&A. I think, any other questions before we?
And then when do we reconvene?
So we are going to reconvene at 2:40 Eastern. So that's basically 25 minutes from now, 24 minutes from now.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, Amy, so what time do you want me to open the breakouts?
Yes. So
Now,
put
are you
everybody
ready
in the
for that?
breakouts. Put everybody in the breakouts now.
Okay, so just so Amy, you're going to be in room 1. Rich, you're in room 2. I'm just making sure each of us. Alex, you're in room 4. And Lucas, I'm going to move you into room 5, but I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms now.
Okay, sweet. So now we're going to jump into these questions. I'm going to also try and take some notes. So hoping that from these questions, we generate some good discussion. Anybody should feel welcome to chime in with their answers. So the first question, which I'm going to ask, because actually it is my question, given we can use Kerchunk to provide cloud optimized access to archival formats, when might we still want to use COG or ZAR files to actually store the data?
Is Ryan, are you raising your hand to answer that question, or?
Yes, but you're a much better person to answer than me. So
I mean, no, I just kind of want to kickstart this conversation. That it really, really depends. I think if you are creating a new data set and your user base for that data set is going to appreciate the ZAR, and you're not worried about not sharing access to, HDF or NetCDF or something, then absolutely please go with ZAR. What I think Kerchunk is really for is for instances in which that isn't necessarily the best choice, whether it be, NOAA's, archive of Go satellite imagery, whether it be, CMIP model data and stuff like that. And so those decisions become more difficult when you're dealing with already existing data sets that are, petabytes large, or with new data sets that might benefit from, as at least in current form, benefit from the more robust support that already exists for HDF, NetCDF. Oh, I guess maybe I should call on someone. Ryan, go ahead.
well, Yeah, I'll even go a little further. I think Kerchunk and the work you guys are doing is a total game changer. And it really provides a much more viable and sustainable path to cloud native for the community, because it allows us to have a sort of a primary first data set in the cloud, the original archival netcdf, which we can do things like calculate checksums for to verify that it's actually the same data that NASA provided. And that gives a lot of confidence around that data set. And so I would advocate that our first copy of any data set in the cloud should be the netcdf sort of Kerchunk. The main downsides of it are, there's two main downsides, one of which is surmountable, which is that only works in Python right now. The only language where you can access that Kerchunk data set is Python. And that's a solvable problem with engineering support. We can make that work in any computer language, but right now it only works in Python. The second problem is more fundamental, which is all that Kerchunk can do is expose the underlying chunks of the original data set, which at maximum are just one chunk per file, or there may be sub-chunks within the data set. And as we saw this morning, not every chunk structure is optimized for every workload. So we'll still have the need to transform data sets on the fly to new chunk structures for particular workloads. And that's where ZAR and the other cloud optimized array formats really shine, because if we want to write those data sets in a distributed format from the cloud, in the cloud, then that is that is where we need ZAR or something like that. So I see like the primary copy, netcdf with Kerchunk, derived copies for analysis, ZAR, TileDB, pick your favorite.
Okay, I wasn't keeping track of who raised their hand first, so I'm going to go to, let's see, Jeff.
I think Zoom does it in order, but I'm not sure.
Oh, Zoom does it in order. Let's see. So that would be Charles then would be next.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is just a very small point about Kerchunk, and I don't know if you have any other experience to add to this, Lucas. I have found, not most, but not every single source file server, whether HTTP or certainly FTP, supports range reads. And so, particularly I've encountered trying to take some data off of, an academic FTP server, which only supports streaming an entire file. That could be solved in other ways, like just moving the netcdf files in raw form to a server that does support that, but it can be a limiting factor. So it's a small point.
Okay, so then we had Ted.
As someone who's worked in a data center for a long time, I think one of the benefits of HDF or netcdf or whatever you want to call it is that it's really a self-describing format. So that blob that's sitting out there in an object store has the metadata that it needs to read itself, and will always have that inside that blob sort of for perpetuity. So that's one of the things that I like about the Kerchunk approach, and I think it's important for long-term preservation. Another thing that someone mentioned, H5 Coro, and one of the nice things about H5 Coro is it's doing, as I understand it, chunk consolidation, right? So if you happen to be reading 5 chunks, then and they happen to be stored contiguously in the file, H5 Coro, someone here probably knows more about it than I, but reads them all in one read. So and then processes, it knows the Kerchunk data, the Kerchunk database or data knows where those offsets are in that set of 5 chunks from 0, the beginning of the thing. So you can process those chunks to decompress them or whatever you need to do. But so that's a nice thing, I think, of that works in HDF. It doesn't work in ZAR, because in ZAR, each chunk is a separate object. So, and coalescing those reads is important, feeds back to the chunk size and chunk organization, right? Because if you have a lot of chunks, it's still a lot of reads, and unless you can coalesce it. So I think those are a couple advantages of HDF objects in the cloud.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It's making me think also we need an additional blog post. There's this cog and czar. Now we need czar and Kerchunk, czar stores and Kerchunk. That's a lot of really great points that you made there. So I need to move along, I think, to Jeff was the next with his hand raised.
Yeah, I was going to make 2 points. One of them Ted just made, that NetCDF is a very good format for long-term preservation, and that's something we don't want to lose. It's nice to be optimized for analysis, but it would be unfortunate to not be able to analyze at all, a few years from now, because the format wasn't good. The second thing is maybe more of a question. It occurs to me, because of this issue of which is the most optimum chunking strategy depending on use case, couldn't Kerchunk support both? So you have one Kerchunk metadata for time first analysis and the other one for space first analysis, and you sort of choose the one that works the best? Or is that not actually possible?
Now, unfortunately, Kerchunk is limited by the chunking scheme of the source files that it's referencing. And so if you're bridging like a multi-file data set, say you have, daily mean files or something like that, and you're bridging those together in a data set, you're limited then to one chunk per file along that time dimension.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Interesting. Okay. Alex, you're next. Alex Mandel.
Yeah, I was just going to bring in another relevant question that was in our list on this topic, which was related to Unidata possibly including ZAR as the underlying storage layout in future NetCDF, and if the group had opinions on how that would change any of this.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Further discussion for sure. Rich?
Well, on that last point that Alex brought up, I think we'll know more about that when we actually see the NetCDF library actually reading Xarray produced ZAR data sets, which supposedly exists, but I actually haven't seen anyone have a actual show that it works. But again, it's a solvable problem. But I just wanted to comment back to something Ryan said about if you writing in parallel. I mean, right now we're producing Kerchunk data sets and we use rechunker and we create ZAR and then we convert the ZAR to NetCDF with this, and that's a serial process. So that's like one of the slowest parts of the whole workflow. And we could certainly, speed that up with parallel NetCDF, and parallel file systems. But, again, these are just things that, remain to be done. But that's the route we're taking at USGS, again, because of Ryan said, people just feel more comfortable with that. Our modelers are all, they don't know about all this stuff, but they want the data to be performant and they're comfortable with NetCDF.
All right, Alexander.
Yes, one thing about Kerchunk, and I think people didn't mention, is that when you generate the Kerchunk metadata, you actually have to have a HDF5 file available somewhere where access is easy. In other words, if that file has already gone to the cloud, it's going to be much more complicated to generate Kerchunk JSON, because essentially you need HDF5 library to go through that file and pick up all that information that you could then put into the Kerchunk metadata. And so that's one factor that maybe people who are thinking about Kerchunk and moving to the cloud and everything else, they should do that when that file is still on some kind of a file system where HDF5 library can really do much quicker. That's one thing that people forget. It is that once you have the file and you create the Kerchunk JSON, then you are done with it, obviously, unless that file changes. But that, I think, is one of the also limitations to Kerchunk, at least once you want to generate these things. Regarding H5 Coro, it's a fundamentally different approach because it basically it doesn't require something like Kerchunk metadata. It doesn't need to ever see that file ever before the first time it is open. Sort of goes through actually the HDF5's file metadata, sort of whatever the information it needs, it chases it up in the file. And so so that is the advantage. It's sort of like a low threshold to start using, doesn't require Kerchunk metadata. The other assumption in H5 Coro is that it assumes that the chunks in the file are adjacent to each other, which seems to be the case if people follow fairly common writing practice, that once you have the data, you just keep writing it out. And so those chunks tend to be one after another in the HDF5 file. But it's not a general reader of HDF5 file format, and it doesn't support some features as well. So it can work or it can fail miserably. So that's something also to keep in mind. And third thing I want to just throw out, HDF5 files can be cloud optimized. It's just that people are not aware of the settings to tell to the library how to generate the file. People usually work with defaults. And so what files come out of HDF5 library are really not cloud friendly. But there are settings that you can use in HDF5 library to actually create cloud optimized HDF5 files. Yeah. But that's another story.
It's hard to synthesize all these good points, but I would say that just not to beat a dead horse, but it sounds like whether Kerchunk or ZAR store files are right for you, again, depends on your use case, right? If you're creating a new cloud data store, it might still make sense to make it a ZAR data store if that's how people are going to be comfortable accessing your data. Whereas if you already have NetCDF or HDF5 on the cloud and can use Kerchunk, make it accessible to Kerchunk in a performant way, it would make sense to do that. That's what I'm hearing so far. Any other thoughts on that question before we move on to the next question, or things that
just to follow up on what Alexander said real quick, I think that's a really important point, Alexander. Like if we're going to rechunk the data anyway, and there's a way in the HDF5 library to make it cloud performant, then we should that should be known, well known, right? That because that's important. Like then you're done.
Yes. And maybe I shall have something more to say on the next DCIP meeting.
Yeah, cool.
It's all about metadata consolidation within the file, right, Alex?
Yes, and also page buffer size and other things that basically just tell and chunk shape and chunk size. You just tell the library, make 10 megabyte or whatever you want, chunk, and the library will do it for you. It's not that the library doesn't want, just, was never told.
And actually, and one other little detail is that I don't think Lucas mentioned is that, Kerchunk is not just for NetCDF4 or HDF5. It's being used for GRIB2, for FITS files, and actually just for geotiffs. So you can access, there's an example where you can access 1 million geotiffs without using GDAL, just using the ZAR library.
Yeah.
It's really kind of showing ZAR more as an API than actually a file format, which I think is an interesting evolution. We've also have things like XPublish that there's not even any like data there. It's just a dynamically served ZAR data set following this sort of ZAR organization and protocol. So it's an interesting pattern to take note of.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to, restructure the presentation of ZAR around its API as basically n-dimensional API access. Right. That could be a good segue into the next question, which is, what are the best strategies for visualizing ZAR stores for large scale, I'll say for large scale n-dimensional data sets in general? So I'm gonna actually, if nobody's ready to answer that question, I might pick on Don to talk about which libraries he used to visualize the data sets for the ocean data sets he worked with.
Yeah, right now I'm actually have like every.
It's a little bit quiet. Can you like lean forward and start again?
Hello.
Yes, cool.
Very good. Okay. All right. Yeah. So I'm using a lot of kind of the HoloViz suite of libraries. There's a lot of ways to visualize using that. I usually, like, if I just kind of exploring the data sets a little bit. I read from the intake catalog using Xarray and then just bring in kind of the HV plot Xarray and then grab whatever I wanted to plot. And that's actually been working pretty well. And right now, one of my other project is working on trying to visualize these kind of bioacoustic sonar data sets. So kind of depth profile and things like that. And they're all stored in ZAR, and just figuring out a way to quickly visualize those things, as long as, and this whole chunk strategy is very important too, in kind of the visualization side, being able to, what's the best chunk so that you can kind of slide through a depth profile over time, that sort of thing. So yeah, like definitely that's kind of my first take, is the whole of it is definitely a good way. Other people have anything on that.
Alexi?
Yeah, thanks, Don. So one of my questions here is, like, I think one of the interesting things about visualization that is not necessarily true of some of the other kinds of analyses that we've looked at is the possibility of, like, sort of not showing every data point, right? Especially for super high resolution data sets. I mean, I think the approach that, like, Carbon Plan uses, from my conversation with them, and I think some of the others have used as well, is you have this sort of like nested tiling structure, right? Where if you're at the maximum outside level of zoom, you only show coarse pixels. Then as you zoom in, you sort of go to a finer resolution, and so on. And I think that they've explored like this, and they even proposed, I think, in addition to the ZAR spec, right? This idea of having sort of, for the same exact data, multiple levels of resolution that you can access quickly, rather than sort of doing those on the fly. I guess an alternative to like aggregating those is just subsampling the data, at roughly the same kind of intervals, which is more of a software problem. But there's also an interesting chunking challenge, because then you're just pulling like one data point per chunk, right? I don't know, there's not really a question there. Just sort of throwing that out there as something that I've encountered and experienced, and wanted to get people's thoughts on this call.
Cool. Any thoughts on that before we? Brian?
Yeah, so there's been a couple different, there's a lot of different efforts on visualizing ZAR in the browser, and they're mostly coming from the microscopy community, they use ZAR extensively. They have all these amazing sort of interactive visualizations, just browser talking directly to cloud storage of these great ZAR data sets. The big challenge is that, just like there's no optimal chunk structure for all use cases, like visualization is a very particular use case that requires, in general, much smaller like granules of data to be pulled from the browser. Like, you don't want to be pulling like 100 megabyte chunks of data from storage into your browser. You're going to crash your browser. It's not going to be fast. It's not going to be snappy. I think a really useful tool that this community could develop would essentially be like a lightweight proxy server that would re-chunk ZAR data sets on the fly based on a selection to provide smaller granules to the browser. And that could be a small lightweight web service that could sit on top of a ZAR in S3 and provide access that's optimized for visualization. It could also do things like caching and make things to make that even faster and snappier. I think that's to complement or what Joe and Carbon Plan did with storing the sort of the hierarchical overviews. I think we should really be looking into this idea of like proxied and dynamic resampling of ZAR data.
Interesting. I was thinking that XPublish could be kind of like this, because you could just serve tiles from XPublish through like the XYZ.
Exactly, and the server side could cache the 100 megabyte chunk, and this just send like 10 kilobyte chunks to the browser exactly when it needs them.
Right. Yeah, okay, yeah. Don.
Yeah, just it's the last point here from me. Yeah, the HoloViz library has this kind of like this technique called data shading.
Really impossible to hear you, Don.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the HoloVis library has this kind of technique called the data shading that they use, which is kind of what I use to power my visualization for all these kind of large data set. And from my experience, it's pretty fast where it kind of subsamples those data and make them into this kind of image representation of the data, which makes it really nice in a way for visualization systems like Plotly and stuff to handle, instead of the billions of data points that I have. It's down to like 500,000 data points, that sort of thing, which yeah, it's been working pretty well, and I'm still trying to kind of see what is the optimal chunking and working with the kind of the data shading ways. And yeah, if you
And
have
Don,
like, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to comment on that. Like that tool also uses like CPUs or GPUs, right? With like Dask and to actually speed up the visualization, right?
Yeah, for sure. And one of my the one thing that I'm trying to experiment is having kind of this the Dask cluster in the back end to kind of power that whole data shading to happen even faster. Right now, I can visualize like a year's worth of second resolution data set in like 45 seconds or something like that. So yeah, it's been good, and definitely trying to figure out what is the best performance, stuff like that.
So I think we can continue on this question a little bit and then also probably jump to one more question, but we are at time for the 10-minute break. So I'm going to propose, if people want to people should feel welcome to take a 10-minute break and just, go off camera and whatever. If people want to continue talking about these questions for the next 10 minutes or so before we jump into the tutorials, I'll stay on to do that with whoever wants to chat more. So I think with Data Shader, I'm wondering if it's doing something similar to, like, it seems like the general concept is that we're creating some sort of overview, some sort of aggregation for each of these different approaches. And so depending on what tool you're using, it's probably creating those overviews differently. And it sounds like Data Shader might be doing it more like on the fly. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, that's definitely what I see.
Cool. Alexi asked, does Data Shader pull all of the data first and then data shade it, or does it actually only request data lazily?
Do you need to have enough RAM to like grab all of the data before it gets data shaded for the visualization step? Or does it actually just, optimize the requests that it makes to S3? And maybe you're the wrong person to ask, I don't know, but like, you see what I'm getting at, right? Like, do you need to pull in all 1 billion data points first and then they get data shaded into like 1,000 points? Or does the data shading happen as part of the pulling in of the points, so they are only actually loading 1,000 points that then get past the visualization?
So from what I see, based on kind of the Dask graphs that are happening, it's so the data is loaded as Dask arrays, and then the data shader takes in those Dask arrays and then run, that it only requests the data that you want. So I don't think it has to like load everything at once. Right now, my problem with this whole kind of high resolution time series is that time is my dimension and X-ray doesn't lazy load the dimension. So I have an issue of just loading in that initial metadata and then, sizing down of which time I want and that sort of thing. But for, I think, geospatial data sets that are not too large, like if data shading works really great, like the bioacoustic sonar thing that I mentioned, the data shading is really great where, I could have kind of the initial overview, a very coarse view of the water column. And then as I zoom in, it actually loads in the more detailed view. So in this way, it kind of works as almost like a geospatial pyramid, which is really cool. But yeah.
Yeah, that's making me realize another generalizable thing that I think I'm hearing is that anytime you have data that's, especially when you're going to have data that has regular updates, the more you can do on the fly in terms of generating chunks and visualizations, probably the less likely you are. Like if you had to pre-generate all of your overviews, those could easily get out of date if you're like regularly updating data. Other thoughts on data visualization or questions before we go to the next and probably last question for this session at least? Okay, so I want to convert some netcdf files to ZAR. Actually, Rich, do you want to ask this question since I've been asking all the questions?
Oh, well, it was sort of a softball question, but yeah, it was basically, you know, is PanGeoForge ready for business? Like, can ordinary people go there and actually convert a bunch of netcdf files to ZAR? And I don't actually know because I haven't done it. So
well, it's a perfect segue into our tutorials, but like, let's let them answer the question.
Right.
I guess I'll take the big picture one there. So there's PanGeoForge really means two things, and we need to get some language to distinguish these. So there's the PanGeoForge Python library, which you can just pip install and start using today. And that is absolutely ready for business and is useful, and many people use it. Then there's the PanGeoForge sort of cloud service. It's basically like a cloud data pipeline as a service. And that is not ready. We are working hard to get that deployed. So the answer is partly yes, you can use that in your own infrastructure as a tool that is a little bit higher level than just writing manual scripts to convert Xarray to ZAR. By the way, it also covers the generation of the Kerchunk metadata. But very soon we hope to have an even easier solution for sort of just where you don't need to run anything on your own infrastructure.
So actually, maybe we should wait for Charles's tutorial to talk more about PanGeoForge, and then we can talk about this next question for what is not going to be enough time. But what makes it, so the question is actually, somebody who asked this question, want to ask it out loud? What makes it analysis ready?
Hey, yeah, this is Tyler Christensen from NOAA. That was my question. So I was curious if you've talked about how this would dovetail with things like the CIOS specs for analysis ready data. So I'm curious, what's the analysis ready in what you're talking about? Because this is why I'm asking the question, is that I think that in the ARD specifications, the one thing that's always been missing for me is how do you access the data? So things about file formats or ways that the data are delivered that make it easier to analyze, right? And it seems to me like that combination of the ARD specs with recommendations on performant cloud formats might be a really interesting combination.
So I'll quickly chime in here. I participated in exactly one conversation about this, so I'm not the best person to ask, but that might be that some others that participated in 0 conversations about this. So we were kind of, the conversation I participated in was specifically looking at this question of like, how does the CIOS analysis ready data spec apply to like level 2 swath level data, which are like physically impossible to make match that spec, primarily because the pixels are different sizes, right? If you look off nadir, then you have some warping of the pixel size. And so then like all of the sort of downstream effects of like everything has to be nice and gridded and on a nice, neat, equal-sized grid sort of doesn't work anymore, right? And that's like all of our level 2 data sets are like that because of physics, right? And so I think that what we came up with was this idea that analysis ready, it's not so much analysis ready data as analysis ready access. And so sort of like depending on the use case, there should be a common entry point, a common API for reading the data set. And that sort of opens us up to experiment with different formats or to sort of future proof the entire system, because you access it using the exact same way. But under the hood, the underlying format might change as something new maybe comes around, although some of these problems are kind of fundamental. And I think that sort of fits nicely with the earlier discussion we were having about like ZAR as like a way of thinking more than like an actual format, right? Or some of these other kinds of things. And some of the things that we talked just now about with sort of dynamic, having something like XPublish serve as a dynamic retiling service for visualizations. So I think that at least that was on that specific question of like analysis ready data for level 2 products. That's sort of what we initially came to at Goddard at NASA as like a good solution. So that's kind of how I think we were currently thinking about it. But I haven't been in any conversations on that since then. That just seemed like the good idea that we came to.
Yeah, actually, I was just gonna, I'm glad, Sean, you raised your hand, because I was just gonna say, if you want to talk about your idea of consolidated endpoint.
Oh yeah, I think we can probably leave that for later too. That's definitely a wider question. But one thing I would say about the CIAS standards specifically is that a lot of the goal for CIAS is to create consistency between products and the definition of products. So that when one organization is saying the near infrared band, that their definition of the near infrared band is the same as another organization's, and so that for end users that there's some consistency in the language that they use to talk about data. And I would say for a lot of the data sets that we're dealing with, and Ryan can talk in more detail about this, the usage of CF conventions really provides that framework for a lot of the multi-dimensional data that we deal with. So there's a consistency in language and a consistency in the definition of the range of the dimensions and how the dimensions are labeled that allows us to have that kind of common framework across organizations. So there's another component to the CF data, as far as the product specification goes, but I think the goal is the same, like having this consistent language that we use to talk about data sets, so that we're not speaking about apples and oranges when we talk about different organizations producing data.
Okay, we have to hop into the tutorials, but I do think that one takeaway, it's kind of interesting because it kind of actually harkens back to the pun not intended with Sean, harkens back to the summer session, which was about how we need to focus less on data formats and more on cloud optimized APIs and access, which is still of course true. This was meant to be, sort of a practical way to get people to more cloud optimized data stores if that's what's necessary. Anyways, with that, let's segue into our tutorials. And I think the first person who's on deck for the tutorial is on PangeoForge with Charles.
Okay, Charles, I've got to make you a co-host so you can present. So just give me a quick second.
Okay.
All right, you should be good to go.
Okay, great. So let me share the right page here. Okay, so let me just get started up here. So hi, my name is Charles Stern. I'm a data engineer at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, and I'll be speaking today about PangeoForge. And specifically, I want to highlight that this is sort of a collaborative and also version controlled method for producing ARCO data. And I'll get into what I mean by that in a moment. So we'll kind of be looking at this through the lens of an example data set. This is the NOAA OISST data set, and many of you, or almost all, I'm sure, would be familiar with kind of an HTTP directory structure that looks something like this. We have monthly directories and then daily netcdf files. And it should also be no surprise for this audience that we can download a single one of those files and open that with Xarray and see that a single file in memory is about 16 megabytes, and the resulting data set has a single time step as well as various data variables in it. Of course, our goal is to be able to do something like this, which is to open the entire data set from a cloud endpoint. That's what we're talking about. And we can do that also because we've created a ARCO version of this data set with PangeoForge, which is 240 gigabytes in memory and has over 14,000 time steps in it. So I want to talk about how we created that data set, and particularly using a part of the PangeoForge platform called PangeoForge Recipes. So PangeoForge Recipes is the framework that we use to define these version controlled modules. And those Python modules are what actually perform the production of the ARCO data stores. So kind of taking a look at the high level architectural view, this module or recipe I'm referring to would be represented here in the chart. And that's something that we're going to talk about momentarily as to how we would go about producing something like that for this NOAA OISST data with PangeoForge. But eventually, in order to produce the ARCO data set that's output by that recipe module, you can kind of see it exists in relation to sort of a cloud architecture here. So we'll have sort of a compute cluster that we refer to as a bakery, in which that recipe is executed, and that compute cluster will extract the data from the traditional archive wherever it exists, in this case, the NOAA HTTP server, perform that ARCO data transformation and deposit it into a cloud bucket from which we can access it. So what do these recipe modules look like? How do I make them? What are these all about? First of all, I'm just going to import a recipe for this NOAA OISST data into this notebook and kind of show you what the source data looks like from the perspective of the recipe. From the perspective of the recipe module, the URLs for all of the source data are organized, but they are wrapped inside of these index objects. And so, for example, the recipe knows that this URL I've highlighted is the first data to organize in the first position in the time dimension, that this URL is for the index 1 or the second position, et cetera, all the way up to, you know, many 14,000s of indices for this concatenation operation. So let's look what that recipe actually looks like. So this is the recipe I've just imported. And you can see that this recipe exists within the PangeoForge GitHub organization. And so what we can probably recognize, even without knowing all the details of PangeoForge, first of all, is that we have sort of a generalized URL pattern here, and the text may be a bit small, for which I apologize, but this is essentially a format string that tells us that, generally speaking, all of this data will exist at this URL, and the day will be existing in this place in the URL, and also here, et cetera. I'm sorry, the date. And we're then instructing PangeoForge that we want to concatenate these URLs over a time dimension, which we specify, and that ultimately we want this wrapped into the xarray-zar recipe class, which is what actually is the algorithm that produces the zar data. For this group, I want to kind of orient everyone a bit to how you would go about making your own recipe for a data set of your choice, and draw your attention to the PangeoForge documentation, which has a recipe tutorials section here. Within the recipe tutorials, there's a lot of different example recipes that you can make, including, by the way, for HDF reference recipes, that would be using the Kerchunk library that Lucas has already spoken about and will speak about again momentarily. But there is also a a tutorial for the NOAA OISST recipe. And this renders as HTML in the PangeoForge documentation, but these are all notebooks that can actually be executed in your own compute environment, which is what I'm going to show you how to do right now. If you were to use this in your own local environment, it's sort of beyond the scope of this short 15-minute tutorial to talk through all the steps of setting up a Conda environment. But we do recommend setting up, setting up a local development environment as described in the development guide section of the PangeoForge documentation, and activating that Conda environment called PangeoForge recipes to make sure these things will run. And then if you've cloned the local repo, excuse me, the repo of PangeoForge recipes that's in the PangeoForge organization, inside the tutorials directory of the documentation, you can find all of these tutorials that you see on the documentation. And I've opened one of them up here. Apologies, we're kind of having a high level flyover here because I want to get everyone oriented to how you would kind of move forward. And obviously there'll be questions which we can try to address, during the session or after. So for the NOAA OISST data, a tutorial like this will walk you through kind of how you relate to the data, just like we did in the notebook, by starting by first kind of downloading one example file, and then opening one of those input files with Xarray and taking a look, for example, at the file size, because as has been discussed in earlier presentations today, ultimately, we're going to be interested in trying to figure out how many of these files we would want to include in a single ZAR chunk. In this case, we already know that the files are about 16 megabytes. And so that will inform our choice of how many files to include in a single ZAR chunk. The file pattern that we've started to kind of discuss already, which is what defines all of these source file URL formats and indexes them in some form, like a concatenation dimension, like we're doing here. That's kind of the most important part of developing the recipe, is defining your file pattern. And this step in the NOAA OISST tutorial talks you through a few different ways of doing that. The simplest way to do it for a recipe which is purely requiring a concatenation of files would be to use this convenience function of the pattern from file sequence. The signature is given here, but the short version is essentially we need to know just a list, a Python list of all of the URLs that we want concatenated in the correct order. And so in order to do that, we define a format string that conforms to the pattern of the URLs, but has a generalized placeholders for the date, for example. And we can use pandas date range function to populate that URL list with 14,000 some odd files and confirm that the file pattern object that we create from that list. I actually was running this beforehand and trying to simplify the tutorial for everyone to see. So a few of the variables may have not been defined. But the bigger point I'm trying to make here is just that this is how you would start using a simple approach to making a file pattern using the pattern from file sequence convenience function. There's also a more extended syntax available to do more complicated things. And again, I think it's probably a bit beyond the scope of a very brief tutorial to explain how all this syntax works, but it's just to expose the audience to the fact that these features exist within PangeoForge recipes, that there's also a more extended syntax. And in fact, that more extended syntax is also using these concat dim objects, is how this recipe I showed earlier was actually created. So jumping ahead a bit, once you have a file pattern that defines your source file URL pattern and indexes them together in the way that you would like, you choose a recipe class. And currently the recipe class options would be the Xarray ZAR recipe, which I'll use here, or there's an HDF reference recipe. That would be kind of the recipe wrapper class for the Kerchunk, for Kerchunk based recipes. Again, you can delve in your own time into the signature of the recipe classes. But one thing to know is that in the simplest possible form, the only thing you need to instantiate or create one of these ARCO data recipe algorithm classes is simply the file pattern. So just by passing the file pattern into the recipe, we've then created a recipe which can be executed to create an ARCO data set. And the one addition, which you can, again, read it in greater depth through this tutorial on your own time, is specifying an argument such as, or a keyword argument such as inputs per chunk in order to define a recipe with a different non-default chunking scheme. So in this case, we know that each input file is about 16 megabytes. So by putting 10 inputs per chunk, we're saying that we'd like our chunk sizes in the resulting ZAR store to be about 16 megabytes times 10, or 160 megabytes per chunk, which for certain applications might be a good choice. In the interest of time, I think I'll kind of pause there at the instantiation of the recipe in this tutorial and just leave you with the thought on this phase, and then I'll have one more wrap up comment about this, but leave you with the thought that by following these recipes, any of these tutorials, including this one, will take you through a series of steps that culminate in actually writing out the data yourself to your own local disk or your own storage target of your choice. However, what you'll ultimately find is that writing an entire ZAR store of many hundreds of gigabytes can take a lot of compute and memory, and it may not be something that you want to devote your own compute resources to, or if you only have your own laptop, it may take quite a long time. That's why when we come back to looking at the structure of Pangea Forge, that's why we offer this bakery compute infrastructure. And the way to kind of get access to that bakery compute infrastructure is ultimately through GitHub and through this repository called Stage Recipes. So that's the Pangea Forge organization Stage Recipes repository. You can see that we already have a number of pull requests in the queue here. If I was to just open a random one, we would see that in each of these pull requests, we have recipe modules. Here's a recipe module for a HiCom ocean model, for example. And when you've submitted a pull request to the Pangea Forge Staged Recipes organization, that initiates the process of the maintainers of the project, including myself, Ryan Abernathy, who's at the meeting today, and others, to review your recipe module, give you feedback. And ultimately, when we merge these recipes, that is how your recipe module is ultimately brought into this cloud compute infrastructure. And a final note I'll leave, because I think I'm up against the 15 minutes, is that if you have questions about this kind of thing, certainly raise an issue anywhere on the Pangea Forge organization. But regarding developing a specific data set, if you don't feel you're ready to develop your own recipe yet, please feel free to open an issue on Stage Recipes, as many people already have. For example, I'd like to propose a recipe for a global HiCom ocean model, or proposing a recipe for ERA 5, etc. So by opening an issue like that, myself and others can help support you in the recipe development process. And I really enjoyed doing that. I would really look forward to working with you to develop the recipe that you would like to develop further and bringing that data to the cloud. So hopefully that made sense. Hopefully that was not too overwhelming and too much information to share. There's obviously a lot to delve into in the Pangea Forge documentation, which is available at pangeaforge.readthedocs.io, is a good place to go as a next step. And I look forward to supporting you in developing those ARCO recipes, and hopefully you can see the value of having those recipes created in a collaborative and version controlled way, so that if any edits or changes need to be made in the future, that we can do that sort of in the public space of GitHub. And there's very much a large degree of transparency as to how the data itself has been produced. So thank you so much for your time, and look forward to speaking with you further.
Awesome, thanks, Charles. Yeah, I think I'm going to be soliciting people's interests in future topics, and I definitely think for me, one of them would be actually sort of pairing on a Pangea Forge recipe. So like as part of a cloud computing cluster session, I think it would be really cool to, actually sort of pair as like a little group based off of those issues. Cool, let's move to Lucas.
Okay, let me share what I need to share here. So let me repost this link into the chat real quick in case anybody wants to follow along. I'm going to be showing off a bit of Kerchunk. I have not really timed this out too much, so I'm going to start with the most important parts first and just see where that gets me. This is the repo for this. If you'd like to follow along, I have two links, one for mybinder.org and one for Jesus, which are two cloud-based notebook environments that might or might not work. Some parts of this tutorial are a bit computationally intense and require more memory, and so those may not work. If you want to run it yourself on your own machine or on your own compute instance, this is what you need to do to get it running there. So once you've cloned and open that repo, there are three notebooks here that kind of describe the three parts of the tutorial I'm going to go through, and then some example JSONs in here, which I'll show off in a sec. Oh yeah, also in the start of the first notebook, there is kind of this overview of what Kerchunk is and how it works. So if you forgot or want to come across this later, you can kind of give yourself a refresher later on. So with that, let's find a data set and Kerchunk it. So first of all, make sure you're on a later release. The current one is 0.0.5. And then we're going to import a few things. Xarray, we don't need pyplot for this one. It's an old import. And this, again, we changed names a while back, so this should be Kerchunk, though I think it works either way. From Kerchunk, we're going to import from the HDF module, single HDF5 to ZAR, and then a multi-ZAR to ZAR. And I'll show you off what these do in a bit, but basically this takes one file and Kerchunks it, essentially. And then this one takes multiple Kerchunked references and combines them into one. And then we're also going to use fsspec to read data and also get file paths and stuff, as well as glob. So for those of you who might not be aware of what fsspec is, it is a unified interface to different file system types: cloud, local, HTTP, Dropbox, Google Drive. These are all the types of file systems it has support for. And so it's a way to unify access to data all within one actual API. And this is part of fsspec is the reference file system, which should be in the list here somewhere. And that is what translates the Kerchunk data, metadata, into actual API calls to like S3 or something like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm interested in taking a 24 hours of NOAA GOES 16 sea surface temperature data off of the public S3 bucket that exists for that. So I'm going to initialize a new S3 file system with fsspec. I'm going to specify that we are in anonymous mode, since we don't need to pay for access to this data set or anything, but you can also provide your own keys if you do need to pay for data. And then from there, I can actually use fsspec and glob through the file structure. I know, I want the 210th day of 2020, and then I just want to wildcard out the rest. So we're going to run that and let it run for a sec. And if we look at the first one, it had found, it goes through and it finds all the files that are within that directory. From there, I actually need the S3 : prepend it to everything. So I'm going to do that and add that to the start. So now we have full URLs to each data set that we want. I'm going to start a Dask cluster. I'm just running this on my local machine, so it's not going to be super big. I think it'll just spawn up 4 workers. Then this should pop up at some point here, and I can actually show that off. But basically, we just need to go and for each file, we need to run this through the single HDF to ZAR. So the more in parallel you can do this, the better. If you spin up, if there's 24 files and you spin this up on 24 workers, they can all create their own metadata file separately. So it's very easily parallelizable, especially with something like Dask. I'm going to bring the task stream and the progress over here just to have
off to the side while we do this. So this is where the magic happens here. This, I am tying a function to generate a reference for a given URL f. And so here are just a few storage options that we need. But the important part here is we're going to use ffspec to actually open that file. And we're going to call it in file. And then we're going to return out this call to single HDF5 to ZAR. We're going to give it the actual file object that we just opened. We're going to give it the URL, and we're going to give it an inline threshold option as well here. And then we're going to do .translate. We can put in, file.json like this, and it'll write out the JSON to disk. But since we're doing this for a bunch of files and we want to consolidate them together later, if you just call it empty like this, it will return a dictionary of all the metadata here. So we're going to go ahead and define this function. For this, I found daskbag works pretty well. What daskbag is really for is to give a really long list of things that you want to process and then separate it up into smaller groups and then process those groups. I actually just want to break it up into as many partitions as there are items in the list. So what we can do is we can actually visualize this here. So basically what this shows is for each URL in file list, I'm mapping genref to it and then saving the output from that. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call bag.compute, and it's going to run these all as parallel as possible, which for me just means running 4 at a time. And this should just take a couple minutes. So I think that's a good point. If anybody has questions, I have the chat open here, or if you want to chime in, I am happy to take questions.
I guess very basic question. So is daskbag basically, you said it's meant to manage like parallelizing groups of operations?
Yeah, so what this is it takes a list or a sequence of items that you.
Oh, you froze for me. Did he freeze for anybody else?
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
Can you hear me still or not?
Can you repeat what you said?
Oh yeah, I'm having. Hello, can you guys hear me?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Looks like something weird happened with my computer because I got a dask error timeout as well.
You consumed all your bandwidth with Dask, and therefore you couldn't stream your video anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I might actually kill this. Again, I never tried this by actually streaming the video. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kill this function. I actually have, for this very reason, a bunch of example JSONs already saved. And so let's take a look at what one of those looks like. So here I have each of the file names, and I just switched out .nc for .json and saved the file that way. So if we open up one of these, it gives us the URL to that file. And so, here's the URL to our netcdf file. And then here are, if you work with ZAR, this will all seem very familiar to you. The ZAR metadata. So these are just the attributes of the netcdf file. And then, so here are individual variables. So DQF was a data quality flag. Here's, information on the chunks, the compression used, the data type, fill values, data shape, and stuff like that. And then each of these chunks, so 0.4, 0.5, are either encoded as base 64, or they are given as a byte range between, the byte range of the actual data. So that is how the ZAR metadata is structured. What we can then do, this loads up. So now if I see that was good take for. Okay, it's like this is yeah, a list of dicts. These are just the same dictionaries. This is what was written out output wise for the step above, but in the example folder. And then from there we can call multi-zar. And what you do there is you pass it these list of dicts. So there's one dictionary for each file reference, and then from there it'll combine them all into one. And this part doesn't take very long. This only took 3 seconds. I can open up combine.json. We can see here we have templates, but instead of just showing one file, it shows a whole bunch of them. And then the references now, if I scroll down trying to find DQF, which I can no longer do because everything else has been added on here. Here we go. You can see now these are 3-dimensional chunks instead of 2-dimensional chunks. So we've essentially expanded this out into a 3D array. And so that's how you create ZAR metadata. And then to access it, I'm going to show off just a real quick example of actually accessing that. So at the core, what you need is you need FSPEC and you need Xarray. This opening the data set generates a bunch of warnings, so I'm just going to ignore those for now. But to actually open the data file, what you need is you need to define an FSPEC file system. We did that in the last step as S3. But here we're going to call a reference file system, give it that combined.json, and then give it the protocol for those files and those remote options to actually access it. Once we've defined the file system, we're going to call getMapper and pass that directly to Xarray open dataset and define the engine as ZAR. It's that simple. Once you have that, it is an Xarray dataset in every other way. I'm also calling metby.parseCF to get some projection information and renaming the description for the time variable just for ease of use later on. But you can see right there, less than 2 seconds, we are able to get this 24 time 5,000 by 5,000 X and Y GOES dataset loaded up into Xarray. And from there, it works as any other Xarray dataset would, and you can kind of plug it in right into your workflow. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just plot the data really quickly with HBplot. For that, I have to reset the coords on it because all of these non-dimension coordinates make HBplot mad. And then I'm also using metpy to get the reference system for the map projection, so I can actually draw borders and stuff on it. So what this is now doing, this is the first point in which we're actually grabbing data from the cloud and pulling it in. And so from here, we have one time slice of this data. We can then zoom in on some area if we want to. If we give it a second, it'll reload everything and it's nice and smooth. And then we can actually just drag the time over. This stuff happens faster if you're also running this on a compute server that is adjacent to your storage. But I'm limited by my home internet access, so this part takes a little bit slower than it necessarily might. But yeah, it's that simple. Yeah. I will end it here and hopefully leave a minute or two for any questions that might have popped up.
Yeah. I think we should take this one question because it came up earlier, which is from Steve. How stable is Kerchunk and what do you see as next set of near-term improvements for Kerchunk?
Yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen so you can actually see me better. Kerchunk is still very early in development. My hope is that at this point, nothing will break a user workflow, but it's, I guess, not guaranteed. I don't know, Rich, if you want to chime in on that since you're a bit more active in current Kerchunk development. But our real goal right now is taking what we have currently and adding more data formats to it. So any real changes that go forward are going to be for incorporating different archival formats into Kerchunk to be able to generate reference files for that.
I mean, I would add, I mean, I think it's fundamentally sound, right? Like if you've got a
Mhm.
JSON and it's pointing at your files, you're good. It's not going to break in any, in any
Yeah.
way that another kind of distributed data set might not, you have issues with. But I think you're right, Lucas, that I agree that the main challenge here is just getting the tools a little cleaner to build these things and for more different, different kinds of data sets, merging variables together and things like that. But those are all pretty straightforward things to do, I think.
Once you have the JSON created, I don't foresee any problems with that being plugged into FSSpec's reference file system and being able to access that in the future. It is the metadata generation that is subject to change a little bit, but I don't think in any way that should unnecessarily hamper anybody's current workflows with it.
Cool. I'm going to take this opportunity to jump in to move into our sort of wrap up and takeaways. Again, this sort of segues into those next steps, which is that as part of the cloud computing cluster sessions that are upcoming, the February, Lucas has already graciously agreed to do a more extended Kerchunk tutorial in February. So that's February 28th is that tutorial. So for that, I'm hoping that we all have, we arrive at that present ready to sort of like follow along, because obviously this is the end of a long working session at ESIP. So that will be a better time for us to sort of come fresh and ready with a fresh cup of coffee or whatever to actually do the Kerchunk tutorial along with Lucas and maybe answer more questions, talk about next steps there as well. So that's certainly one wrap up and takeaway item. The slides that I'm sharing now are again to highlight the upcoming cloud computing cluster sessions. So the action items on the slide before is you can join the cloud computing cluster email list at this link. You can also join the ESIP Slack workspace and cloud computing cluster channel with this link. And you can access the cloud computing wiki with this third link. When you join the cloud computing cluster email list, it's not a very busy list. It's basically just to announce the upcoming cloud computing cluster session. So you'll get that notification about upcoming sessions. So the next one will be this 24th, January 24th, which is this upcoming Monday. So obviously gives us a little bit of more time to digest everything that's come in through this session, both in terms of questions and notes from people. I'm going to be taking the questions and the poll answers, as well as any notes that we've had during this session and the chat, and synthesizing notes for sort of like the guidance documents that we're working on for future blog posts, future cloud computing cluster activities. So that's going to be an informal, January 24th is going to be sort of an informal session to talk about, what we talked, basically everything we talked about during this session, and talk about next steps. February 28th is going to be this extended Kerchunk tutorial. And then March 28th, I'm soliciting any sort of, what do people want to hear about next? Do we want to do more tutorials like this? Do we want to talk more about any of these conversation topics that came up? And then obviously there's always good activity in this community in terms of knowledge sharing experiences, like some of those lightning talks that we heard earlier. So I wanted to take a moment to hear from you guys if you had any main takeaways right away that you want to share, and any ideas on what you already know you might want to like to continue conversations in the ESIP cloud computing cluster meetings. So just for a few minutes, anybody have any immediate reactions to those questions. What are your takeaways from this session? And what conversations or activities would you like to continue in following ESIP Cloud Computing Cluster meetings?
Well, I guess one is is that we're not wasting our time in the ESIP Cloud Computing Cluster by continually talking about all these topics we touched on today, because it's not all figured out.
Yeah.
And so, just another, if you find this stuff interesting and you're in this arena, please come join us.
Yes, thanks, Rich. Yeah, so absolutely, everybody, I certainly am going to try and digest everything and come to that January 24th meeting with some more ideas. So other resources I wanted to highlight were just our previous knowledge sharing sessions. We have, if you're interested in hearing what we talked about in the past, which we had a really great presentation in October for Microsoft Planetary Computer. Rob Emanuel and Tom Augsburger talked about the Microsoft Planetary Computer. And then we heard from Dar Han at QHub about deploying, your own sort of Jupyter Notebook DAS cluster with QHub. So those previous knowledge sharing sessions are all part of our YouTube Cloud Computing cluster playlist. So you can access those. And then there's also a link to our last summer's session notes as well. So with that, I want to just say a huge thank you to my co-organizers. So that's Rich, Annie, Sudhir, and Rob Casey. They've all been an immense help both in organizing this session and just generally in terms of the running the ESIP Cloud Computing Cluster. So thank you again to you all, and then all of the speakers and tutorial presenters. I'm really glad you guys could all contribute to this session. So thanks so much, and yeah, enjoy the rest of ESIP. Annie, did I miss anything?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think you deserve most of the thanks. So, so I think my fellow organizers and I would also mirror that thanks back to you. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and just lastly, encourage everyone to take a break, but a reminder that we do have the research showcase tonight, which is a list of about 20 posters and demos. Some of these topics are covered, and so we'd encourage you to pop over there at any point. So thanks so much, everyone.